So firstly, a good Chodesh, everybody. And I want to thank the organizers for inviting me to be part of this Verbringen. Let's say that a Verbringen can accomplish more than Malach Michal. So b'schus us coming together on Rosh Chodesh Iyar, l'schus Chof Nissan, please God, through this Verbringen, may we have the Isgalus of Moshiach take it from Yad Mamish L'chaim. You know, when I was in yeshiva, in my yeshiva days, which was Labates, Mem Aleph, the koch was miftoim. There's a tremendous koch for miftoim. I'm not saying that there's not a koch now, but there's a tremendous koch for miftoim. I remember Miftzah Sefer Torah. I mean, people were signing up hundreds, thousands of people. There was such an amazing koch. I remember Rabbi Kunin taking 4 Bochrim down to California. And he goes over to one of the Bochrim, he says, no, how many people you signed up? So the Bochrim wanted to make it sound big. So he's thinking, he says, 5,900. Rabbi Kunya looks at him, he says, 5,900. Here in California, we don't speak hundreds. We speak thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions, but we don't speak hundreds. But there was the most amazing koch throughout all the miftzah. And I'm not saying that there's no koch now, but from Tov Shin Mem Beis, there was a different theme. The Rebbe started to speak about Bias Moshiach and Geulas Moshiach and Divrei Moshiach. And that frenzy just kept building. And then came just before Tov Shin Nun. And the Rebbe said, Tahei, shnas, nissim. This is going to be a year of miracles. And that year, communism was dismantled. And then came Tov Shin Nun Aleph. And the Rebbe said, Tahei, shnas, aren, niflos. It's going to be a year of wonders. And that year, look at the miracles that took place in Eretz Yisrael with the Scots. We all went on those solidarity trips. It was unbelievable to see. And then the Rebbe said, open your eyes. I remember at a meeting of Shluchim in Johannesburg. It wasn't a Verbringen, it was a meeting late afternoon. And the Rebbe just said that, and one of the senior Shluchim stood up and he said, hold on, does this mean we say L'chaim? Are we ushering in the Geula? That's the frenzy. And then all of a sudden, Chof Nissan came. And the Rebbe delivered that sikha. There was pandemonium. People did not know what to do. The Rebbe called for suggestions and people were faxing. In those days, there were faxes. People were faxing in ideas. Now, when you think about it, when you learn the sikha, when you analyze the sikha, one of the things that the Rebbe was saying is, one of the things that the Rebbe said is that whatever has happened until now is lehebel velorik. Now, how can you say that? How can you say whatever happened was lehebel velorik? By that time, by Tov Shin Nun Aleph, the Rebbe had turned the world upside down. Let me share a story. In 2010, Lord David Young was Margaret Thatcher, Prime Minister of England, Margaret Thatcher's Minister of Trade and Industries in the early 80s. While he was here in 2010, it was the World Soccer Cup, he came, he spoke for Chabad youth. And he got up and he said as follows. He said, you know, in 1970, that's 40 years before, he said, in 1970, I made a few predictions. One of them I really got wrong. He said, and remember, he belongs to an Orthodox shul in England, very high up in the Conservative Party. He said as follows. He said, one of the predictions I got wrong. He said, I felt that by the year 2010, there would be no more observant Judaism. There would be Zionism, there would be nationalism, there would be traditionalism, but there wouldn't be observant Judaism. Guess what? He said he was so wrong. You know why? Because Lord David Young, like many others, did not see what the Rebbe was doing. If you jump back to 1970, and I say this with caution, not to passel people's tefillin and mezuzahs, but most people's mezuzahs and most people's tefillin were possible, even the very few that did put on. The level of kashrus throughout the world was a disaster. Rabbi Popek, the shlich in Cape Town, said recently that when he got to Cape Town, in Tov Shin Lamed Vov, the Rav of the city had allowed women to use the Turkish hot baths in the city as a mikveh. I mean, just think of that. That's how bad things were. And then came the Rebbe, mitzvah after mitzvah. Think about Tov Shin Lamed Ches, Education Day USA. Think about all that the Rebbe had done. Think about the Rebbe's influence in Israel by that time. So how can it be that the Rebbe says that everything we've done until now is lehebel belorik? And I think what the Rebbe was saying was as follows, that no matter what has been accomplished until now, and we've accomplished a fortune. Think coming after the Holocaust, we've accomplished an untold fortune. But until we have the Isgalus of Moshiach, nothing has been accomplished, because on Yud Shvat Tov Shin Yud Aleph, that's what we set out, Dor Shvi, we set out to bring about these Isgalus of Moshiach. And until that happens, no matter what has happened in the whole world, even if everybody's from, we've accomplished nothing. Because by the Rebbe, success was the enemy. The enemy is success. Hatzlacha can be the worst success. Hatzlacha can be the biggest enemy in the world. You know why? Because when a person feels a bit of hatzlacha, you start to pat yourself in the back, you start to pinch yourself, you think you're so special, and you start to say, so I'm not getting 100 out of 100, I'm getting 90 out of 100, I've built this building, I've done this, I'm a carib this, I've done so much. Until the ultimate goal is being achieved, what the Rebbe set out in Nutshvat, Tovshin Yun Aleph, said Rebbe, this is all lehevel balorik, do not drop your standards. Which leads to the next point. So how do we bring Moshiach? How do we bring Moshiach? So undoubtedly, there has to be personal avodah. There has to be kibush yirecha, controlling our machshava, dibur, and ma'aseh. There has to be sumer ravi yasei tov. There has to be kadis kafya sitra achra. There has to be an absolute commitment to the Rebbe's inyonim of Chittas and Rambam. There has to be an absolute commitment to Lichshayafutza Ma'ana Secha Chutza, which will bring Moshiach. There has to be an absolute commitment to the mitzvahim of the Rebbe, each and every mitzvah. There has to be a commitment, there has to be a commitment to go out and get the world to increase in acts of goodness and kindness. When the CNN reporter walks by the Rebbe and says, what is your message for the world? The Rebbe says, Moshiach is ready to come. All that's needed is to get people to increase in acts of goodness and kindness. If I'm not mistaken, the part of the video is not shown. There's another part to that video where the interviewer says to the Rebbe, what's your message for the jury? And the Rebbe says, no, they must ask the Rebbe. They're rabbis. So the Rebbe felt for going, we've got to start by getting them to increase in acts of goodness and kindness and Sheva Mitzvah, etc. And then ultimately, we've got to teach the world that Moshiach is about to reveal himself. We've got to get the world excited about that Moshiach is about to reveal himself. But when you think about it, all the other mitzvahim, all the other activities, they're quite easy to measure. You can measure how many menorahs you've been out. You can measure how many tefillin you've put on. You know, pre-COVID, Rabbi Dovid Heller, one of the shluchim here in Johannesburg, right, put tefillin on over 24,000 times during a year, during a Jewish year. Think about that. In other words, sometimes the same people over and over again, but he put tefillin more than 24,000 times on that year. He started at 18 and then he got to 24,000. You can measure it. You can measure how many houses you've kashed. You can measure how many mezuzahs you put up. Even Abbas Yisrael, I suppose you can measure it by how many favors are done. But when it comes to Moshiach, it sounds just so abstract and so difficult to do. Let me share a story. Cell phones like we know them today, came to the world in the early 90s. So about 93, 94, it was coming to South Africa. The man responsible for bringing it to this country was none other than a Jewish businessman by the name of Theo Ratstein. Very respected in the industry, a good friend of Chabad, very well-respected individual. By the way, he was also responsible for bringing television to this country. The South African government, the previous government, was very anti-TV. They didn't want TV in this country. So television only got here in 1975, was like the test pattern. In 1976, TV officially was launched. But until then, there was no TV. So what did he do? In the late 60s and early 70s, he advertised to the country that one day TV is going to come. What you should do, he said, one day TV is going to come. Put your name on the list, come into us, put your name on the list. Eventually, when TV comes, there's going to be such a shortage. If you're on the list, it'll be first come, first serve. And then guess what he did? He got hundreds and thousands of people to sign up. He then took that list to the government and he said, hey, government, we're petitioning you. There are hundreds and thousands of people who are demanding television. And the government acquiesced. They succumbed. They allowed television. Now, by the way, we should do something like that with Moshiach. We should get people all over the world to sign a petition to the Eibishter. But that's for another time. Now, let's come back to cell phones. Cell phones didn't have opposition. There's no opposition to cell phones. But at a lunch just before they were being launched. Now, this is a man who's involved in telecommunications. He understands the industry well. He's done his market research. Right before, it's like days before cell phones are about to be launched, there's a lunch and he speaks, and I happen to be at the lunch. And he said like this, he said, because, and if you must remember, what was there before that? Before that was the big Philips Porty telephone, which weighed a ton, or the Siemens card, or the Siemens phone, or if you were very rich, you had a car phone, but everybody wanted these things. But anyways, at the lunch, he gets up and he says, you know, cell phones are about to be launched. However, because of the cost of calls, cell phones are going to be a luxury item that will only be used for necessity. It will never become something of everyday use. 3 days later, cell phones are launched and it just swoops the country. The country becomes drowned with cell phones. And all of a sudden, there's a new disposable income. In fact, other industries like beer and alcohol suffered very badly because people were putting their money into this new thing. And something that he thought would be a luxury item, never used, all of a sudden every single person was using it. Let me just put it into perspective. There's 35% unemployment in South Africa. 95% of people have cell phones. You can't be the poorest people on the phone the whole time. Imagine it. But he couldn't see it. Why couldn't he see it? Because he was caught up in the past. He couldn't imagine a world with cell phones. He just couldn't do it. Let's go back to television. Television was invented in 1927. For the first few years, it never took off. Only in 1939, it started to take off. But people wrote, in America, people in the know wrote that television will never, ever take off because nobody wants to sit in their lounge looking at a wooden box. The housewife, the woman, would prefer to take a vacuum cleaner and vacuum around the house and listen to the radio. So television has no chance. Now, how could it be? Today, 98% of American homes have TVs. I think I saw on Google, there are 110 million TVs in America. More than one. It's unbelievable what there is. And yet these people who lived it couldn't see it as it was about to be revealed. It's exactly the same thing with Moshiach. Exactly the same thing. We caught up in the past. Let me share a story that I read on Chabad.org. It happened with Menachem Mendel of Vitebsk. By the way, his Yotzat is tomorrow. They came to him, they came to his study, they came to his office, and they said, Moshiach is here, right? Moshiach is, he was delighted to hear. He was thinking, this is beautiful. And anyways, he walks over to his window, he opens up the window, he takes a sniff, and he says, Moshiach is not here. In other words, in his Daled Amos, Moshiach was there, right? What's it? Matana Eten Eschem. Moshiach was there, he lived with Moshiach. I got news for us. On Chof Ches Nissan, and I say this with caution, on Chof Ches Nissan, Tov Shin Nun Aleph, the Rebbe took us into Gan Eden HaElyam. And the Rebbe showed us, and the Rebbe made us see, and he opened up our eyes to see that we can bring Moshiach, and we have to bring Moshiach. Until then, by the way, in my view, like Moshiach was like a Rebbe's thing. But on that day, the Rebbe opened up our eyes that we have to bring Moshiach. So how do we bring Moshiach? So number one, we've got to speak about Moshiach. You know, we're starting Perek Beis and Perek Avos this week. One of the mishnahs that we'll read on Shabbos is even in the privacy of your own home. Don't say something that ultimately will be understood. So there's two pirushim on it. One of the pirushim is, even if you're alone in your house, and there's nobody there, the whole family's away, and you're alone in your private room, don't say something negative. Because if you say something negative, the birds that fly by will hear it, and the weasels that come into the house will hear it, and they'll carry it. In other words, when you say something, even in the privacy of your own home, you bring it into Olam HaDibur and then into Olam HaMaaseh. So conversely, when you speak about Moshiach, even in the privacy of your own home, you're bringing Moshiach. You got to bring Moshiach. We got to learn about Moshiach. And I must say, what Tut Alts has done in the last few months with this wellspring of stuff, which has made it so much easier. We got to get a nash excited about it. We got to have messaging. We got to have very clear advertising messaging for non-anash, for traditional Jewry, for unaffiliated Jewry. We have to tell the world. We got to bring it. We got to bring it into Olam HaDibur. You know, it's interesting. The advertising agency who designed our logo here for Moshiach, it's like, just imagine it's WWWM. So it's quite a modern thing. We want Moshiach now. So when he devised this thing, he came to us and he said, you know, here's the logo. And he said, but don't just use it as a logo. He said, you know, make playground furniture with it. Do all sorts of things with it. At first, we thought he was absurd. And just recently, we realized this guy's actually quite clever. Was every single time you see something, it must trigger Moshiach, Moshiach, must trigger Moshiach, Moshiach, Moshiach. We have to do that. We have to, whatever we're doing. And we've got to get people excited about Moshiach. Now, I say that as we bring here today, cities are being invaded. we have to conquer our own Ir Katana. And not only do we have to conquer our own Ir Katana, we have to invade other Ir Katanas. And with the nuclear energy that the Rebbe explains we all have, the atomic energy that we have in our Nefesh Elokis, we've got to go out and we've got to turn this world absolutely upside down with every possible means to tell the world that Moshiach is about to reveal himself. Let me share with you just the power of advertising the message. Many years ago, there was the Minister of Finance of South Africa, a colored gentleman, a very fine gentleman, spoke at a Chabad dinner. And it was a pre-recorded message. He was in Cape Town, it was pre-recorded. Anyways, at the end of his message, he says, oh, and by the way, he finishes his message and he says, and the answer to the world's problems are, we want Moshiach now. He's a non-Jewish guy. So somebody went over to him and said, where do you know that from? He said, listen, before I was Minister of Finance, I lived across the road from the Chabad school in Johannesburg. There was a big sign there, we want Moshiach now. I learned about it, and I learned what that means. We have to tell the world the great things that are going to happen when Moshiach comes. That beautiful thing from JLI, of how much the world is bettered from 1820 to 2020. We've got to go tell the world that. We're not showing the world. The world's still caught up there. We're not showing the world the great advantages of what's going to be when Moshiach comes. I wanted to show a video here, but I couldn't find it this morning. But it's a proper news channel. Maybe I'll send it in afterwards. Somebody else can show it. It's a news piece from one of the big news stations of a playground in Mexico. And it was that they took guns and they cut the guns up and they turned it into playground equipment, fulfilling the prophecy of the Torah. Now let's just think a little bit abstract. While we have to use every medium and every measure to go and spread this message of Moshiach and get people excited with all sorts of programs in a very, very organized manner, as the previous Verbrenger said. But maybe we should be going to arms manufacturers in America and England, all over, that manufacture weaponry and arsenal, and ask them, hold on a second, why don't you just make a few spades? And we want to use the spades to give it to underprivileged people to farm. But what will that do? It'll start changing the paradigm. That these people stop thinking that, gee, not the only thing that we make over here is weaponry. So we've got to take this atomic energy and we've got to explode the world with it. And I want to just end off, by the way, because there is we only have one enemy in that, and that's ourselves at the moment. I want to end like this. The Rebbe says as follows: Yagati u'mitzasi ad shavoy le'mitzia ikris mitzasi David Avdi shokoi al Moshiach tzidkenu haba behesach hadas. That's what are we waiting for? So let's take this amazing koyach of Chof, this amazing power of the Verbrengen, and in Mitzvah we should bring about these galus of Moshiach today. Take it from Yad Mamish v'hu yigolenu.